Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today I want to talk a little bit about genetics, and more specifically about light and dark skin, and kind of fill in the context of where we're at right now in terms of present day knowledge of how skin color originated and the necessity for populations to sort of adapt their skin color based on their what's around them, their surroundings. And after reading a few articles like this, I realized that it's pretty limited, our knowledge, mainly because of the sample, the studies that have been done so far. Their samples are kind of skewed in a certain region, and we'll get into that in a bit. So this article is actually, it comes from last year, October of last year, but I think it's really relevant because it's pretty kind of game changing in terms of how you understand genetics and skin color. It's not as simple as it's made out to be. The headline is "The Ancient Origins of Both Light and Dark Skin. A study of diverse people from Africa shows that the genetic story of our skin is more complicated than previously thought." It's kind of a hot button issue talking about skin color, culturally and socially anyway. A lot of people are they kind of use it as evidence to support certain racially powered views, and I think those types of people would do well to do a little bit more research, because it's a lot more complicated than it seems. So right now the current perspective by science, by mainstream science I guess, is that people moved out of Africa and they evolved lighter skin in order to better absorb vitamin D in namely Europe. The problem is that most of the studies come almost entirely from studying people of European descent. So their sample comes from Europeans mainly. So because of that, we know very little about how our genes influence the actual pigment. So this woman, Sarah Tishkoff, who's a geneticist at the University of Pennsylvania, she did a pretty huge study. And what she did was she took ethnic groups from Africa instead of Europe. And Africa is very important because it's supposedly the continent where humanity originated in the very beginning. So what she did was, from Africa, she recruited 1,570 volunteers from 10 different ethnic groups and 3 major parts of Africa. So if you look at the map here, she went to Ethiopia, which is Eastern Africa, and then she went to Tanzania, which is south from there, and then she went to Botswana, which is Southern Africa. So although this is not entirely like the entirety of Africa, these ethnic groups is pretty dense population wise and is very diverse as well. So I think it's a pretty good sample size to work with, and it's not even a huge number. It's not a huge sample either, but it's significant. So what she did was she measured the amount of dark pigment melanin in the skin of their inner arms. So melanin, if you don't know, is what makes your skin darker when the sun hits it. So the more melanin you have in your skin, the darker it'll appear. So after they measured the amount of dark pigment, the team looked at more than 4 million spots in the volunteers' genomes where DNA can vary by a single letter. And then from there, they tried to identify which variations are associated with skin color. So they found 6 specific genes: SLC24A5, MFSD12, DDB1, TMEM138, OCA2, and HERC2. So from here, they were able to show that the variants collectively accounted for 29% of the variation in skin color in the 3 countries studied. So that's a pretty big proportion, especially since her sample size wasn't that big. For comparison's sake, in another study relating to height, hundreds of genes were identified, but the ones that collectively account just 16% of their variation in large populations. So so basically what that means is, if a study is done on the skin pigmentation, they're probably likely to find even more specific genes that affect skin color. So this is 16%, so 29%. That's a lot. That's 13% difference. So that's very significant, and right away that should warrant a completely new study. Tishkoff says that her results complicate the traditional evolutionary story of human skin. Already went over that earlier. So in the traditional view, again, humanity began with dark skin in Africa to protect from the sun's radiation, and then as people migrated out, they evolved lighter skin from there. That's the current narrative right now, the widely accepted scientific narrative. What Tishkoff found was that the variants have an ancient African origin, which likely rose in hominids like Homo erectus and Neanderthals and stuff, long before Homo sapiens even came about. So these genes already were there before any human migration to Europe ever started, if that makes sense. So remember, the narrative is that the genes that coded for different skin pigmentation, the narrative is that it evolved pretty recently when humans left Africa, but really it's way before that. So in many cases, the older variant is responsible for lighter skin, not darker. And this idea is consistent with another study from Nita Jablonski, an anthropologist from Penn State. And she also thinks that the ancient ancestors of humans had pale skin. So they started out with pale skin first, and then they lost their hair, and then evolved darker skin from there. So dark skin as a Homo sapiens was not the default. It was actually an evolution, the end of an evolutionary adjustment, so to speak. But there are more changes. Different groups of people adapted their own particular environments, but not just around the world, but within Africa too. So remember, Africa is a huge place, right? There's a ton of different people, and they all look very different. It's not that everybody has the same dark skin. There's a lot of variation just within Africa alone, which makes sense. I mean, you can fit 3 United States, like continental United States, into the continent of Africa. That's how big it is. So that's not to be underestimated. So that's why there has to be a larger study than this to really get to the root of this thing. So right now we have a lead, but we don't have concrete conclusions yet, although some of the results are very compelling. So her team's measurement showed that the Nilotic peoples in East Africa have some of the darkest skin around, while the San of Southern Africa have light skin, comparable to some East Asians. So let me show you a picture of the San people. So these are the people that they're talking about, and you can see that they do have dark skin, but it's comparably lighter. Same thing here. These children here, they have really light skin compared to other Africans, and it's very comparable to East Asians, right? I would say so. The physical diversity is mirrored in these groups' genes. The first gene identified as affecting human skin color, MC1R, is very diverse in European populations. So basically, it's not super common in European populations, but remarkably similar across African ones. Because of this, some of the more traditional geneticists concluded that the evolutionary pressure for dark skin in Africa was so strong that any genetic variants of altered skin color were weeded out by natural selection. But that's not really true, as evidenced by these people here, right? What happens, Tishkoff says that's not true, but she's saying what happens is when you only study skin color in the Western countries, that's the natural conclusion you're going to come to. So it's a perspective issue. When you look at this African-centered perspective, there's a lot of variation. And so if you look at it from the traditional view, where again, the people migrated to Europe and then weeded out some of the useless genes by natural selection, yeah, that makes sense when you're using Europe and the European genetic pool as your base and your European-centered perspective. But when you flip the tables and come from an African-centered perspective, then suddenly you see a lot of variation. Like those genes that are quote supposed to be weeded out are actually variants, and there are a lot of them. So here's an example. There's a gene called MFSD12, and it has variants that are linked to darker skin, and which are very common in dark-skinned people in Ethiopia and East Africa, but they're rare among the San people in South Africa. So this gene, MFSD12, shows how the research for pigmentation genes can reveal new insights about the basic biology of our skin. So to put things in perspective, 2 years ago, the gene didn't even have a name. So in 2015 and before then, there was no name for it. The only information that they had about it was that it was somehow linked to vitiligo, which is people develop white patches on dark skin. Michael Jackson was famous for having this. In order to figure out detailed information about MFSD12, they deleted that gene in fish and mice. And from there, they were able to confirm that it controls the balance between light and dark pigments. There's another gene called SLC24A5, which is traditionally been seen as European because it's associated with light skin. But Tishkoff's team, again, showed that the variant entered the East African gene pool first from the Middle East, well before the Arab colonization. So today, it's common in Ethiopian and Tanzanian groups, but rare in others. So again, you have this contradiction of conclusions here. And then in East African groups, the variant doesn't lighten skin color to the same degree that it does Europeans. So a person can carry a gene that confers a particular trait in one population, but it's not obvious physically in those people sometimes. So even though somebody carries that genetic variant, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be expressed in their body. So it's this is why it's so complicated, and you can't jump to conclusions right away. So that's basically what this study is showing. That's the most glaring thing about this study, is that, man, we don't know enough to even come to concrete conclusions yet. And not just the people conducting the study, but everyone who's said anything about skin color in the scientific community. So it's not concrete. It's not a done deal yet. There's a lot more to discuss. So Sandra Beliza, who's from the University of Leicester, she's done one of the most, the only other genetic study of skin color of people of mixed African ancestry. Just as an aside, I'm surprised that there haven't been more studies done on the people of Africa. I'm very surprised at how few have been done in studying skin color. And I'm very surprised that most of the skin studies are done on fair-skinned people in one region. They should be doing it in China, everywhere, not just Europe and not just Africa either. Although they should do them in both, but they should do it everywhere else too, just to get to the bottom of the truth. So anyway, Sandra, she says that neither of her work nor Tishkoff's have come close to identifying all the genes beyond this trait. So in order to plug that gap, again, like I just said, there needs to be more genetic studies, and in African populations and everywhere else. And then at this point, the article goes into like white supremacy, how a lot of people use skin color as a means of dividing people. And she's saying that in light of all these genetic studies, it's a terrible classifier. Even without supposedly dark skin, there's a lot of hidden variation. The study really discredits the idea of a biological construct of race. There are no discrete boundaries between groups that are consistent with biological markers, which is an interesting thing for her to say. Because visually distinguishable traits common in present-day Europeans, such as light skin color, are also assumed to have arisen within European populations, white supremacists treat these traits as a proxy for superior intelligence. So yeah, they use this as an excuse. Hey, because our skin color or our bodies evolved from dark skin, it's an upgrade, therefore we're smarter. That's a complete logical fallacy, and it carries no scientific weight. The history of SLC24A5 reminds us that light skin pigmentation and likely other European traits are not unique to Europeans. Human populations have been interbreeding for as long as we have existed as a species. So basically there's no pure race. Humans are humans, and the variations that exist between them are largely based on evolution and natural selection and environment over generations. Several genes that influence skin pigments, Europeans are actually more likely to be genetically similar to great apes, That's because they say this. I don't know if this is true or not, by the way, but if they do say that primates originally had fair skin, the primates that we evolved from, they started out with fair skin and then got darker skin, that makes sense too, because I mean, if you're fair skin and you go into the sun, you get darker, right? I mean, that's an adjustment your body's making. So it appears to me that if you were, let's say you were the first human generation who just came from apes, and then you shed your hair, your fur, and you were white, then you went out into the savannah, because remember, people came from the rainforest receded, and so into the savannah. So once in the savannah, the sun's gonna shine down on you. It makes sense that people in Africa have dark skin now, because their body made that adjustment. I mean, I just went out today and I feel like I'm super dark. So what do you guys think? I know it's a lot to take in, and I hardly understand genetics as many scientists don't even understand it. But I think it's very compelling, and again, another example of the pitfalls of studying and making conclusions and doing research based on a very specific sample size. So the moral of the story is, let's have a greater sample size, and let's have a more diverse amount of test subjects to really get to the bottom of this. Because right now, I think people are taking certain evidence, nitpicking some evidence, and attaching all of these other values toward it, and trying to use it as a club to beat over the head of other people who don't have those traits, just to further their own agenda or whatever, and they're not really being responsible with the information and the conclusions. So what do you guys think? I think I would love to hear what your comments and your take on this, and every discussion's welcome in the comments, so I encourage you. So I'll see you guys tomorrow or Monday, one of those two, maybe not tomorrow. But yeah, have a good one until then.